The dust had not yet settled on the grave of his youngest son when Wesley Crawford made a promise to himself that he would never ride into Caldera Falls again. And for 3 long years, he had kept that promise with the iron stubbornness of a man who had nothing left to protect but his own grief. The year was 1874, and the New Mexico Territory was a land that chewed men up and spat them out without apology. Wesley Crawford understood that better than most. He had come to this territory as a young man of 24 with a wife named Ruth, a homestead claim on 40 acres of dry red earth, and the kind of hope that only the young and the foolish carry without flinching. By the time he was 31, he had built something real out of that hope, a house with a solid roof, a barn with 6 horses, 2 sons named Thomas and Jacob who laughed like their mother and worked like their father, and who were, without any question in Wesley's mind, the finest things that had ever happened to him. Thomas had been 14. Jacob had been 11. They had ridden into Caldera Falls on a Tuesday morning in September of 1871 to fetch a bag of flour and a letter their mother had sent them to collect from the post office. They had not come home. The cholera outbreak that swept through Caldera Falls that autumn had taken 43 people before the town even understood what it was dealing with. Among those 43 were the Crawford boys, who had both taken sick within hours of each other and were gone before the week was out. Ruth had fallen apart after that, and Wesley had watched her grieve herself into the ground over the following winter, and by March of 1872 she was gone too, not from cholera, but from the kind of heartbreak that has no medical name but is just as fatal. Wesley had buried all 3 of them on the hill behind his house, under a single oak tree that cast the kind of shade in summer that made you believe the world still had some kindness in it. Then he had locked the front door of his house, saddled his horse, and gone out to his fields, and he had not stopped working since. He got supplies from a traveling merchant named Old Clarence who came through every month. He traded pelts with the Navajo men who passed through his eastern boundary on their way to the trading post. He spoke to almost no one and wanted to speak to almost no one, and that was the arrangement he had made with the world, and the world had mostly honored it. Until the morning of April the 3rd, 1874, when Wesley Crawford rode into Caldera Falls for the first time in 3 years, and everything he had built around himself began to come apart at the seams. He had not planned to go that morning. He had risen before dawn the way he always did, fed the horses, checked the fence line along the northern pasture, and made himself a breakfast of salt pork and cornbread that he ate standing at his kitchen window, while the sun came up pink and gold over the mesa. He had every intention of spending the day repairing a section of the barn roof that had buckled under the weight of the last winter's snow. But then Old Clarence had not come. He had been expected the previous Thursday, and then again on Sunday, and now it was Wednesday and there was still no sign of him, and Wesley's salt supply was down to nothing. His coffee had run out 4 days ago, and the single candle he had been rationing was burning its last quarter-inch in the pewter holder on his table. These were not crises, but they were accumulating in the way that small lacks tend to do, pressing against each other until the sum of them became something that required action. He stood at the kitchen window for a long time after breakfast. He looked at the hill where the oak tree stood, and he looked at the road that led south toward Caldera Falls, and he said out loud to the empty kitchen, "It is just a town. It is just buildings and people. It does not have anything to do with them." He said it the way a man says something when he knows it is true but does not yet feel it to be true. Then he went and saddled his roan gelding, whose name was Fletcher, and he rode south. The 12 miles between his homestead and Caldera Falls took about 2 hours at an easy pace, and Wesley rode slowly, not because Fletcher could not move faster, but because Wesley found himself in no particular hurry to arrive. The territory in April was its own kind of beautiful if you let yourself look at it. The desert wildflowers were coming up along the roadside, little splashes of yellow and purple against the red dirt. The sky was that particular shade of blue that you only get at elevation, clear and deep, and so enormous that a man could feel very small inside it without it being an unpleasant sensation. He passed the old Hendricks spread, which had been abandoned for 2 years, the house sagging in the middle like a tired horse. He passed the creek crossing where he and Thomas had once caught a catfish so large that neither of them had believed it until they held it in their hands. He did not stop at the creek. He kept his eyes on the road and kept Fletcher moving. Caldera Falls announced itself the way most territory towns did, first with the smell of wood smoke and livestock, then with the sound of hammering and voices, then with the sight of its single main street coming into view around the curve of the red rock formation that gave the town its name. It was not a large town, maybe 400 souls on a good day. A general store, a livery stable, a barber shop, a doctor's office, a land office, a saloon called the Spur, a church with a crooked steeple that had been crooked for as long as anyone could remember, and a 2-story building that served as the hotel and the post office combined, run by a man named Gerald Finch, who was the nosiest human being in the New Mexico territory, and possibly in the entire American West. Wesley rode down the main street with his hat pulled low and his jaw set, and he felt the eyes of the town on him the way you feel sun on the back of your neck. He recognized faces, and some of the faces recognized him. He nodded to the men he knew well enough to nod to, and did not invite any further interaction, and he made his way to Holt's General Store and tied Fletcher at the hitching post out front. The bell above the door of Holt's General Store rang when he pushed it open, and the smell of the place hit him all at once: coffee and soap and dried beans and leather and sawdust, and something sweet that might have been cinnamon, and it was so familiar that it knocked the breath out of him for a moment. Because the last time he had stood in this doorway, he had been standing between 2 boys who were arguing about whether they could convince their father to buy them each a stick of peppermint candy from the jar on the counter. He stood very still for a second. Then he breathed through it. Then he walked in. Roy Holt was behind the counter, older than Wesley remembered him, his hair gone fully gray and his mustache enormous in the way of men who have decided that if nature is going to take their hair, it will not take their dignity. He looked up when Wesley entered, and his face went through 3 expressions in rapid succession: surprise, a kind of cautious sympathy, and then the professional blankness of a merchant who knows better than to make a customer feel observed. "Wesley Crawford," Roy said. "It has been some time." "It has," Wesley said. "I need salt, coffee, candles, and whatever dried goods you can put together for about a month's worth of supply." "I can do that," Roy said. He began moving around the counter, pulling things from shelves. "You heard about Old Clarence?" Wesley looked up from the bag of coffee beans he had been examining. "What about him?" "Took a fall off his wagon out on the Sandoval Road about 2 weeks back. Broke his hip. He is over at Doc Pierce's place. They say he might be laid up for a month or more." Wesley absorbed this. It explained the missed visits. "I will go by and see him," he said, and meant it, because Old Clarence was as close to a friend as Wesley had any more, which was a melancholy fact, but a fact nonetheless. He was settling up his bill with Roy Holt when the door opened behind him and a woman's voice said, "Mr. Holt, I am very sorry to come in again so soon, but I am afraid I miscounted, and I am going to need 2 more pounds of flour before I can finish what I started." The voice was not loud or demanding. It was clear and warm and a little bit breathless, the voice of someone who had been hurrying, and it had a slight lilt to it that Wesley could not quite place, somewhere south and east of the territory, maybe Texas, maybe further. He turned around because it was the natural thing to do when someone enters a room, and that was the first time he saw Maria Hurst. She was standing in the doorway with the April sun behind her, one hand still on the door frame, and she was wearing a blue calico dress that had seen better days and a white apron that was dusted with flour at the hem. Her dark hair was pinned up, but several strands had escaped and were curling around her face in the April warmth. And she was flushed from whatever hurrying she had been doing. And she was looking at Roy Holt with an expression of such genuine and good-humored apology for the inconvenience she imagined she was causing that Wesley found himself standing very still for the second time that morning. She was, he judged, somewhere in her late 20s, perhaps 27 or 28. She was not conventionally beautiful in the way that the illustrated papers described beauty, but there was something in her face that was far better than that, an animation, a quality of being thoroughly and completely present in whatever moment she was standing in, that made it impossible to look away from her without feeling like you had missed something. She noticed Wesley standing at the counter, and her expression shifted to the polite acknowledgement of a stranger, a small nod, the kind you give in a store to someone you do not know. "Good morning," she said. "Morning," he said, which was more than he had said to a stranger in quite some time. Roy Holt was already measuring out her flour. "Miss Hurst, this is Wesley Crawford. Wesley, this is Maria Hurst. She has taken over the Ray's place out on Copper Creek Road. Been here about 6 weeks now." "7," Maria Hurst said pleasantly. 7 weeks and 2 days, not that anyone is counting. She smiled at her own small joke, and the smile was the kind that involved her whole face, and Wesley felt something shift in his chest that he did not have an immediate word for. "The Ray's place," he said, because he had to say something, and that was the most neutral thing available. "That is about 3 miles east of my land." "Is it?" She looked at him with genuine interest. "Then you are the Crawford homestead. I can see your barn from the ridge on my north fence. I wondered who was out there." "That is me," he said, which was not the most articulate thing he had ever said, but it was the truth. She collected her flour from Roy Holt, tucked it under her arm with the ease of someone accustomed to carrying things, and gave Wesley Crawford one more of those full-face smiles. "Well, I suppose we are neighbors then, Mr. Crawford. It is nice to know your name." Then she was gone, the door swinging shut behind her, and Wesley stood at Roy Holt's counter with his purchases and a feeling he could not quite identify, something like being woken up in the middle of a very deep sleep, not unpleasant exactly, just disorienting. Roy Holt was watching him with the expression of a man who has lived long enough to recognize the look on another man's face. "She makes pie," Roy said, entirely unprompted. "Brought one in for the church social last Sunday. Apple and blackberry. Best thing I have eaten since my wife was alive." "I am sure it is very good," Wesley said, picked up his supplies and left. He visited Old Clarence at Doc Pierce's place, sitting with the old merchant for an hour, and listening to him complain about his hip and the quality of the broth the Doc's housekeeper made, and promising to check in on his wagon and horses which were stabled at the livery. Then he loaded his supplies onto Fletcher and prepared to ride back to his homestead, and it was only when he was turning Fletcher's head north on the main street that he saw the commotion outside the land office. There were 2 men standing on the boardwalk outside the land office, and between them was Maria Hurst, and even from 50 yards away Wesley could read the shape of the situation clearly enough. One of the men was heavyset and red-faced, wearing a coat that was too expensive for Caldera Falls and boots that were too clean, and he was doing the talking. The other was younger, maybe 20, and was lounging against the wall post with the studied ease of someone who does not expect to need to do anything because the man in the good coat expects to get what he wants without assistance. Maria Hurst was standing very straight, her chin up, holding her flour under one arm and a document of some kind in her other hand, and while Wesley could not hear what was being said at this distance, he could read her posture perfectly well. She was not afraid, but she was outnumbered. He sat on Fletcher for a moment. Then he clicked his tongue, and Fletcher moved toward the land office at a slow, deliberate walk. As he drew closer, the voices resolved into words. The man in the good coat was speaking in the measured, pleasant tone of someone who has learned that threats land harder when they are delivered calmly. "I am simply telling you, Miss Hurst, that the Ray's deed has some complications that a woman on her own might not fully appreciate. Mr. Harlan Fitch has a prior claim on that parcel that predates whatever it is you purchased from the Ray's family, and he is prepared to be generous in compensating you for your trouble if you are willing to be reasonable about it. I am always reasonable, Maria Hurst said, and her voice was steady in a way that Wesley found himself admiring. I purchased that land legally through the Territorial Land Office with a signed deed of sale from Eduardo Reyes, witnessed and recorded. If Mr. Fitch believes he has a prior claim, he is welcome to make that argument to a territorial judge. Judges are expensive, Miss Hurst, the good coat said, and you are a woman alone. Perhaps you should consider. She does not appear to be alone, Wesley Crawford said. He had stopped Fletcher directly in front of the land office, and he was looking at the man in the good coat from under the brim of his hat with the particular expression of a man who has nothing to lose and therefore nothing to be cautious about. The man in the good coat turned to look at him and did not seem particularly impressed. "This is a private matter, friend." "I am not your friend," Wesley said, pleasantly enough. "I am her neighbor." He looked at Maria Hurst. "Is there a difficulty here, Miss Hurst?" She looked at him for a moment, and he could see her deciding something behind her eyes. Then she said, "Mr. Devlin here was just explaining to me that a man named Harlan Fitch believes he has a claim on my property. I was just explaining to Mr. Devlin that any such claim would need to be addressed through the proper legal channels." "That sounds correct to me," Wesley said. He looked at the man named Devlin. "Does that sound correct to you?" Devlin stared at him for a moment longer, doing the mental arithmetic that men like Devlin always do, weighing cost against benefit, and evidently deciding that the benefit of pressing this particular point today did not outweigh the unknown quantity of the weathered, quiet-eyed man on the roan horse who did not appear to be bluffing about anything. "We will be in touch, Miss Hurst," Devlin said. He adjusted his coat, gestured to the younger man, and walked down the boardwalk with the dignity of someone who is retreating but intends to make it look like a decision. Maria Hurst watched them go. Then she looked up at Wesley, and something in her expression softened just slightly, a controlled relief that she was not willing to make a big show of but was real nonetheless. "Thank you," she said. "I did not do much," Wesley said. "You did enough," she said. Then, after a moment, "This Harlan Fitch, do you know him?" Wesley thought about it. He had been out of the loop of Caldera Falls business for 3 years, but the name stirred something at the back of his memory. "There was a Fitch family here before I left town, but they were not in land speculation. This might be a newcomer." "He is a newcomer," she said. "He arrived about 3 months ago, and in the time since, 2 families that I know of have been pushed off their claims, both of them people who did not have the resources to fight it. Mrs. Ibarra lost her 40 acres to the east of town, and the Montoya brothers lost their cattle range on the mesa. Fitch is buying up land or taking it through whatever means are available to him, and the territorial authorities are not moving fast enough to stop him." Wesley dismounted from Fletcher and tied the reins to the hitching post. He stood on the boardwalk and looked at her more directly than he had in the store. "You have been here 7 weeks and you already know all of this." "I listen," she said simply, "and I care. The Montoya brothers are good men, and what happened to them was not right." She paused. "I will not let it happen to me. I did not come all the way from San Antonio with everything I have to be frightened off by a man in an expensive coat." "San Antonio," he said. "That accounts for the accent." She looked at him with a raised eyebrow and the ghost of a smile. "I have an accent. I thought everyone else had the accent." "Fair point," he said, and it surprised him, because it had been a long time since he had said anything that could be described as even adjacent to light humor. They stood on the boardwalk for a moment in the April sunshine, 2 people who had been neighbors for 7 weeks without knowing it, and the ease of the silence between them was slightly remarkable given how little time had passed since they first spoke. "I should get back," she said. "I have bread that is in the middle of being made and will not forgive being neglected too much longer. And I have a barn roof," he said. She picked up her flower more firmly under her arm and stepped down from the boardwalk. Then she paused and looked back at him. "Mr. Crawford, if you ever find yourself out my way, you are welcome to stop in. I think good neighbors are worth cultivating in this territory." "I think you are right," he said. She nodded once, the way a person does when something is settled, and walked away up the street. Wesley untied Fletcher and swung up into the saddle. He sat there for a moment looking down the street in the direction she had gone, and then he looked at the town around him, the familiar buildings and the familiar sky and the red rock formation at the town's edge. And the grief was there. It was always there. It did not go away. But it was sitting differently in him today than it had been sitting that morning. It was a stone in his chest that he had been carrying for 3 years, and it had not gotten lighter. But today, for the first time, it felt possible that a man could carry it and still have both hands free. He rode home through the afternoon light and fixed the barn roof, and he thought about Maria Hurst from San Antonio, who listened and cared and made apple and blackberry pie, and was not afraid of men in expensive coats. He did not go to her homestead the next day, or the day after that. He was not a man who moved quickly toward things, and he was also not entirely sure what he would say if he went, so he stayed on his own land and worked, which was what he knew how to do. But on the 5th day after his ride into town, he was riding his fence line along the eastern boundary when he saw a rider coming up Copper Creek Road from the south, and the rider was moving fast, and as they came closer, he recognized the blue calico dress under a leather riding coat and the dark hair coming loose from its pins. He turned Fletcher toward the road and met her at the gate. Maria Hurst reined in her horse, a brown mare who looked moderately put out by the pace she had been set, and Wesley could see immediately that something was wrong. Her face was controlled, but her jaw was tight, and her eyes had the brightness of someone who is very angry and is managing it very carefully. "Mr. Crawford," she said, "I am sorry to come to you like this. I was not sure where else to go." "What happened?" he said. "Someone cut my north fence last night. I had 8 head of cattle that are now gone. I rode the fence line this morning and found the cut clean wire with proper tools, not an accident, and I found tracks heading northeast toward the mesa." Wesley absorbed this. "Fitch." "I cannot prove it yet," she said. "But yes, Fitch." "Did you go to the sheriff?" She looked at him steadily. "Sheriff Aldous Webb has taken no action on the Ibarra case or the Montoya case. I went to his office this morning, and he told me cattle wander and fences rust. He told me it with a straight face." Wesley thought about Sheriff Webb, who he remembered as a man who had been competent enough before whatever had happened with Fitch to shift his loyalties, or more likely his accounts. It was the oldest story in the territory. A man with money arrives, and suddenly the men with authority find their opinions becoming very flexible. "Tracks heading northeast," Wesley said. "That would put them toward the Fitch Range on the mesa." "That is what I think," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Can you ride for another few hours?" She blinked. "Yes." "Then follow me," he said. "I know the mesa better than anyone. And I know a man who might be able to help you get your cattle back through proper channels, if we can confirm where they are." The man he was thinking of was Judge Henry Totham, who rode circuit through the territory and had his base in the town of Loretta, 20 miles east. A man who was incorruptible in the way that only a man who has been offered every corruption and refused every one of them can be, and who took a particular and personal satisfaction in the failure of men who used money as a substitute for law. Maria Hurst looked at him for a moment, and he could see her deciding whether to trust him, which was a perfectly sensible thing to be deciding about a man she had met 4 days ago. Then she nodded. "Lead the way," she said. They rode northeast toward the mesa together, and Wesley found himself talking more in that first hour than he had talked in 3 years combined. He told her about the geography of the mesa and the cattle trails that ran through it, about the water sources and the season's effect on grazing patterns. Practical information. But she asked questions that pulled him along, intelligent questions that told him she had been paying very careful attention to this land in her 7 weeks on it. "How long have you been on your homestead?" she asked at one point. Since 1866, he said. 8 years. That is a long time to know a piece of land, she said. It becomes part of you, he said. Or you become part of it. I'm not always sure which direction the absorption goes. She looked at him sideways with that quality of complete attention she had and said, "That is a very beautiful way to put it." He felt the heat rise slightly in his face and was grateful for the shadow of his hat brim. They found the cattle as afternoon was coming on, penned in a makeshift enclosure on the eastern edge of the mesa, with Fitch's mark already partially applied on 2 of the animals and the rest showing signs of having been roughly herded. There were no Fitch men at the enclosure at the moment, which suggested they were not expecting anyone to find it this quickly. "This is evidence," Wesley said. He pulled out the small notebook he kept in his coat pocket for fence measurements and tallied the cattle, noted the partial marks, and sketched the location. "I can testify to this if it comes to that." Maria Hurst was looking at her cattle with an expression that combined relief and cold fury in equal proportions. "I want to take them back right now," she said. "I know," he said, "and we can. But if we take them back without documentation and witnesses, Fitch will simply deny it and take them again, or worse, have you charged with something. We do this the right way." She turned and looked at him, and the fury was still there, but underneath it she was listening. "You sound like a man who has thought about how the wrong way goes." "I have seen enough of it," he said. She held his gaze for a moment. "All right," she said. "We do it your way." They rode to Loretta the following morning, having spent the night on their respective homesteads, and met again at dawn at the fork of Copper Creek Road. Judge Totham received them in his office with the calm efficiency of a man who has heard 1,000 variations of the same story and has not yet run out of patience for any of them. Wesley presented the notebook documentation. Maria Hurst presented her deed. The judge examined both with the same expressionless attention and then looked up. "This is sufficient for a retrieval order and an injunction against further interference with the Hurst property," he said. "I will have both documents prepared by tomorrow morning and dispatched to Sheriff Webb, who will be reminded in no uncertain terms of his obligations under territorial law." "And the cattle can be returned?" Maria asked. "The cattle will be returned," the judge said. "And if Harlan Fitch interferes with that return, he will find himself on the wrong side of a federal warrant." They walked out of Judge Totham's office into the afternoon sun of Loretta, and Maria Hurst stopped on the boardwalk and put her face up toward the sky and breathed out very slowly. "Thank you," she said, and this time the 2 words carried considerably more weight than the first time she had said them. "You would have gotten there yourself," he said. "You did not need me for that." "Maybe," she said. She looked at him. "But I needed you to know where Judge Totham was, and I needed you to know the mesa, and I needed you to talk me out of doing something hot-headed with those cattle yesterday afternoon. That last one I will take credit for," he said. She laughed, and it was the first time he had heard her laugh, a real laugh, warm and unguarded, and it did something to the air around her that was difficult to describe except to say that the afternoon seemed a little brighter for it. They rode back west together, and the sun was going down behind the mesas to their right in long orange and red streaks across the sky, and the desert was doing what it sometimes does in that hour, showing off with complete shamelessness, turning every rock and scrub bush and dust particle into something gilded and extraordinary. "Why did you come to this territory?" he asked her, somewhere in the middle of all that light. She was quiet for a moment. "My husband died," she said, 2 years ago. Yellow fever in San Antonio. We had a small farm there, but his brother held the note on it and called it in when Thomas passed." Wesley absorbed the name. Thomas. He did not say anything about the coincidence. "I had a little money saved," she continued, "enough to get to the territory and buy the Rays parcel. Mr. Rays wanted to go back to his family in Socorro and was willing to sell at a fair price to someone who would keep the land working." She paused. "I was not willing to be someone's poor relation in San Antonio. I have a sister who offered, and she is very kind, but I am not built for it." "No," he said. "I do not think you are." She glanced at him. You say that like you know me. I know that type of determination, he said. I have some of it myself. She studied the road ahead for a moment. Mr. Holt told me a little about you, she said. About your family, she stopped. I hope it is not too forward to say that I am sorry. The stone in his chest shifted. He let it. Thank you, he said. It is the hardest thing there is, she said quietly. Losing children, there is no part of it that makes sense or gets smaller. I have lost people I loved, but not that. I cannot imagine it. No, he said, you cannot unless you have. And you have been out on that homestead alone since then. Since March of '72, he said. She was quiet with that for a moment, respectful of its weight. Then she said, and you rode into town today anyway, for the first time. Candles, he said. She glanced at him again, and there was something in her expression that was very careful and very gentle. Just candles. He was quiet for a long moment. The horses walked on. The sunset did its best work. Then he said, Old Clarence stopped coming, and I could not sit in the dark any longer. She nodded slowly. Well, she said, I am glad the candles ran out. It was such a simple thing to say, and it hit him with such unexpected force that he had to look away at the mesa for a moment to recover himself. So am I, he said, and meant it in ways that he was not yet ready to make explicit. They parted at the fork of Copper Creek Road in the last of the evening light. She turned east toward the Ray's place, and he turned north toward his homestead, and he sat on Fletcher for a moment after she had ridden a little way and watched her go. The brown mare moving easily along the road in her straight back and the dark hair and the leather riding coat. And Fletcher shifted under him with the impatience of a horse that knows the barn is nearby and supper is possible, and Wesley made himself move and rode home. He did not sleep well that night. Not from grief, for once. From something else entirely. She came by his homestead 2 days later, not in distress this time, but bringing something. She knocked on his door in the mid-morning, and when he opened it, she was holding a pie dish wrapped in a cloth. Apple and blackberry, she said. I had a surplus of both, and it seemed a shame not to use them. He stood in the doorway with what he suspected was an expression of complete stupidity on his face and said, You did not need to do that. No, she agreed pleasantly. But I wanted to, and you did help me with the cattle situation, which is not nothing. May I come in? He stepped back and let her in, and noticed simultaneously how small the house looked with another person in it, and how much less empty it felt. She put the pie on the table and looked around with the frank curiosity of someone who sees no reason to pretend she is not curious. The kitchen was clean in the way of a man who has made a discipline of cleanliness because the alternative is chaos, and it was spare, with almost nothing decorative. And the one photograph on the mantel above the small fireplace was the one he had of Ruth and the boys, taken in 1870 by a traveling photographer who had come through Caldera Falls, and he saw her see it. She did not say anything about it. She just looked at it for a moment with the same quiet respect she had shown on the road, and then she turned back and said, Do you have coffee? I have been rationing mine, and I thought I might impose on yours. I went to town last week, he said. I have coffee. He made coffee. She sat at his kitchen table with the ease of someone who does not stand on ceremony, and they drank coffee and ate pie, and the morning came through the kitchen window in bright squares of light, and they talked. They talked for 2 hours. He could not have told you afterward exactly how it happened. The conversation just kept opening up new rooms, and they kept walking into them together. She told him about San Antonio, about growing up the daughter of a schoolteacher in a family that had more books than furniture, about marrying Thomas Hurst at 22, and the 8 years they had together before the fever took him, about the farm and the brother-in-law and the decision to come west. He told her things he had not said to anyone in 3 years, carefully at first and then with increasing ease, about Ruth and the boys, about the homestead and what it had meant to build it, about the years since, about the way grief calcifies around you if you let it until you can barely move inside it. You have been letting it calcify, she said, not accusing, just naming it. Yes, he said, I think I have. I tried to, she said, After Thomas, to stay still inside it, but I found I could not. I kept waking up in the morning and wanting things. Wanting coffee, wanting to see what the day looked like, wanting to know what would happen next. She looked at him across the table. I think wanting things is what keeps you upright. He thought about that for a while. I have been wanting things, he said slowly. I just have not been letting myself have them. The look she gave him then was one he thought about for the rest of that day and the following night. She left mid-morning with a promise to come by and let him know when the judge's retrieval order had been executed and her cattle returned. She did come by, 3 days later, this time with news and this time staying even longer, and they walked the fence line together because he had offered to help her inspect the cut section and repair it properly. And they worked together with the comfortable coordination of two people who both know what they are doing and do not need to explain themselves. "You are good at this," she said, watching him splice the wire. "I have repaired about 100 miles of fence in 8 years, he said. "It shows. You are not bad at it yourself," he said. "I grew up on a farm," she said. "My father was a school teacher, but my uncle was a rancher and we spent summers with him. I learned what I needed to learn." When the fence was done, they sat on the gate post, and she produced a cloth-wrapped package of cornbread from her coat pocket, which made him laugh out loud, the first genuine laugh that had come out of him in so long that it surprised both of them. "You carry cornbread in your pocket," he said. "I carry things I might need," she said with great dignity. "Cornbread is frequently useful." "I cannot argue with that," he said, and took the piece she offered him. The cattle were returned the following week by a very grim-faced deputy who had apparently received instructions from Judge Totham that left no room for interpretation. And Sheriff Aldous Webb came personally to Maria's property to inform her that Harlan Fitch had agreed to cease all activity related to her claim. He said this with the expression of a man who has been thoroughly dressed down by someone of higher authority and is making his peace with it. "What happened to Fitch?" Wesley asked that evening when she came to tell him the news. They were sitting on his porch in the last of the daylight, which had somehow become a thing they did now, meeting in the evening on one porch or the other and watching the day end. "Judge Totham apparently sent a letter to the territorial governor," she said, citing 3 specific cases of land fraud by intimidation. "There is now an official inquiry. Fitch has apparently decided that further activity in this direction is not in his interests." "Good," Wesley said. "Yes," she said. She looked out at the darkening mesa. "It is good when the right thing happens. I do not take it for granted." "Neither do I," he said. They sat in the comfortable quiet that had become the texture of their time together, and the stars came out over the territory the way they do in April, suddenly and completely, as if the sky cannot help showing off. And Wesley was looking at the sky, but what he was really aware of was the woman sitting 3 feet to his left on the porch bench, and the warmth of her presence, and the way the evening air had taken on a quality of importance that he had not felt in a very long time. "Maria," he said, and the sound of her first name surprised him slightly because he had been calling her Miss Hurst and had not decided to change that consciously. It had just happened. She looked at him. The starlight was doing things with her face that the daylight did not do, making the line of her jaw and the dark of her eyes into something that belonged in a painting he was not qualified to make. "I know this is not the conventional time," he said, "and I know we have not known each other long, but I have not been a man who says things when they need to be said in a long time, and I do not want to be that man anymore." She was very still and very attentive. "I think about you when you are not here," he said. "I think about things I want to show you and questions I want to ask you and conversations I want to have with you. And when you come by, I find that the day is better for it in a way that I stopped believing the day could be, and I do not want to not say that." She looked at him for a moment in the starlight, and he could not read her expression fully, which was unusual because he had found her very readable in almost every other context. Then she said, "I have been waiting for you to say something for about 3 weeks, Wesley Crawford." He stared at her. "I am not a woman who lacks patience," she said, "but I was beginning to wonder if I was going to have to say it myself." were you?" He said, and was aware that something had just fundamentally shifted in the geography of his life. "I was very seriously considering it," she said, "and I will tell you that it would not have killed me. I have done harder things than tell a man I like him." "You like me," he said, and he knew he was smiling, could feel it happening on his face like a thing that had not happened in a very long time but had not forgotten how. "I more than like you," she said, with the directness that was so characteristic of her. No drama, no artifice, just the plain, clear fact of it. "And I think you know that." "I am beginning to understand it," he said. She reached over and put her hand on his, which was resting on the arm of the bench between them, and it was a simple thing, her hand on his, warm and steady, and it undid him a little in the best possible way. "I am not a substitute for grief," she said quietly. "I need you to know that I understand that. What you lost cannot be undone, and I am not asking you to put it behind you or pretend it did not shape every part of who you are. I just think there is room for both things if you want there to be." He turned his hand over and held hers. "I think there is too," he said. "I think I have been afraid that wanting to live again was a betrayal of them." "It is not," she said, with the certainty of someone who has thought about this carefully. "It is the most honest way to honor what you loved." He sat with that for a moment, and the stone in his chest was still there, but it had lost some of its hardness, had become something that he could breathe around instead of a thing he had to breathe in spite of. "Will you let me court you properly?" he said. "The way a person should be courted." She squeezed his hand. "I would like that very much." He did court her properly. He came to her homestead on Sunday mornings, and they rode together across the mesa and down into the valley where the creek ran, and he showed her the places he knew, and she showed him what she had found in her weeks of exploring her own land. He brought her things from town when he went, which he was going more regularly now, coffee and writing paper, and once, in a moment of uncharacteristic impulse, a length of green ribbon from the dry goods shelf at Holt's that he thought might look well in her hair, and which he handed over with considerably more awkwardness than he would have liked. She held the ribbon and looked at him with those dark eyes and said, "You thought of me in the store." "I think of you constantly," he said. "That is not new information." She laughed and wound the ribbon around her fingers, and the next time he saw her she was wearing it and it did look well. He told her about Thomas and Jacob with more detail as the weeks went by, carefully at first, and then with the fullness of a man who has been holding a story inside for years, and is finally finding someone worthy of hearing it. He told her what Thomas had been like, serious and methodical and funny in a dry, unexpected way that had always delighted his father. He told her what Jacob had been like, quick and physical and full of the kind of joy that spills over into everything around it. He told her about the fishing at the creek crossing, and about the time the two of them had tried to teach themselves to rope from watching the vaqueros who passed through, and had roped each other instead and collapsed in a heap of laughing and tangled cord. Maria listened to all of it with the quality of attention she brought to everything, and she laughed when it was funny and was quiet when it was heavy, and never once made the mistake of trying to fix it or move past it. "They sound extraordinary," she said one afternoon in June when they were sitting by the creek. "They were," he said. "They were genuinely extraordinary. I was aware of it even then, which I am glad for. That I did not take it for granted." "You did not," she said. "I can hear it." He looked at her. The June light was full and warm, and the creek was making its small music beside them. "I have not talked about them like this to anyone," he said, "since—" "I know," she said. "Thank you for trusting me with them." He reached out and tucked a strand of dark hair back behind her ear, the green ribbon at work there but not quite managing the afternoon's breeze, and it was the most natural thing in the world and also the most significant, and she seemed to understand both of those things simultaneously. "Maria," he said. "Yes," she said softly. "I am falling in love with you," he said. "I think you should know that." She looked at him for a long moment, and he could see the emotion moving through her face, not hidden but controlled, the way someone looks when something they have been hoping for arrives, and they are very carefully making sure it is real. "I know," she said, "because I am falling in love with you too." He kissed her there by the creek in the June afternoon, her face warm from the sun and her mouth warm, and everything around them the deep summer green of the territory after the spring rains. And it was as natural as the creek and the light and the breeze. And it was also, without any question, the most alive he had felt in 3 years. They spent June and July in the way of people who have found each other and are taking their time about it because they know the value of what they have. Sundays and some evenings. Work on her property and work on his, often done together because 2 pairs of hands and 2 heads are better for nearly everything than one. She had taken to keeping a kitchen garden behind the Ray's house, and he helped her put in a proper fence for it that would keep out the deer, and she came and helped him replace the rotted boards on his front porch, and they talked the whole time they worked, about everything and nothing, and the ease of it was something he had not expected, this ease, this sense of being exactly in the right place. Old Clarence recovered from his hip by late June and resumed his circuit, and when he came through Wesley's homestead in July, he took one look at Wesley's face and said, "Something has happened to you." "Several things," Wesley said. "Good things," Old Clarence said. It was not a question. "Yes," Wesley said. "Good things." Old Clarence had been delivering to the Ray's place as well, and he came back from there the following month with an expression of deep satisfaction and said, "Miss Hurst asked me to tell you that you have been invited to Sunday dinner and not to bring anything because she has it covered." Sunday dinner at Maria Hurst's table was one of those experiences that Wesley Crawford would remember clearly for the rest of his life, not because anything dramatic occurred, but because of the quality of it, the roasted chicken and the fresh bread and the blackberry jam she put up herself, and the way the afternoon light came through the window of her kitchen, and the way she moved in that space with the ease of someone who belongs exactly where they are, and the way the conversation moved between them as naturally as breathing, and the way it felt like something he had been missing without knowing it had a shape. They went to church together in August for the first time, and the town noticed, the way small towns notice everything, with the full weight of collected attention and the inevitable conversations that followed. Roy Holt said nothing, but his expression when Wesley came into the store with Maria was the most satisfied expression Wesley had ever seen on a human face. Gerald Finch at the hotel said entirely too much, but most of it was complimentary. Several women who had known Wesley before made a point of introducing themselves properly to Maria, and she received them with the warmth and openness that was natural to her, and it went well. One afternoon in August, sitting on Wesley's porch after supper, Maria said, "I want to ask you something, and I want you to tell me honestly what you think." "Always," he said. "Would you ever consider," she said, taking her time with the words, "combining the 2 properties?" He looked at her carefully. "I do not mean tomorrow," she said. "I mean in principle. The Ray's parcel and your parcel together would be over 80 acres, which is a real ranch. We are already doing half our work on each other's land anyway. And the cattle operation I have been building would be significantly stronger with your horses and your knowledge of the range." She paused. "I am not just talking about property, Wesley. I am talking about everything." "I know what you're talking about," he said. "I am a practical woman," she said. "I find it easier to say the practical parts first." "And the less practical parts," he said. She turned and looked at him directly in the evening light. "I love you," she said. "I want to build something with you. I want to wake up in the morning on the same piece of land as you and spend the rest of my years on this earth in your company." "That is the less practical part." She paused, "although I would argue it is actually very practical." He was quiet for a moment that felt very long but was probably only 10 seconds. "Maria Hurst," he said. "Wesley Crawford," she replied in the same tone. "Will you marry me?" She laughed, that warm, real laugh that brightened whatever air it was in. "That was not quite how I envisioned this going," she said. "I gave a whole speech." "Your speech was excellent," he said, "but the question still needed asking." She took his face in her hands, both of them warm and slightly roughened from the work of living in this country, and she looked at him for a moment with everything she felt right there on the surface, not performing it but not hiding it either. "Yes," she said. "Of course, yes." He kissed her in the August evening, and she kissed him back, and the roan horse in the corral made a sound of complete indifference to the whole proceedings, which they both found very funny. They married in September of 1874 in the Caldera Falls church with the crooked steeple, on the 11th of the month, a warm, dry day with a sky that was doing its best work. Old Clarence stood up for Wesley, and a woman named Elena Montoya, who had become a friend of Maria's in the months since the Montoya brothers' cattle dispute had brought them together, stood up for Maria. Judge Henry Totham rode in from Loretta for the occasion, which he said was simply because he happened to be passing through, and which no one believed for a second. Roy Holt brought a crate of his best coffee to the reception afterward, which was held in the churchyard with trestle tables, and every person in Caldera Falls who could walk to a church seeming to show up, because in a small town a wedding is one of the great communal occasions, and no one is going to miss it. Maria wore a dress of deep blue silk that she had sent away from Santa Fe, and she had pinned the green ribbon in her hair, and when Wesley saw her walking toward him down the aisle of that small church, he had the strangest feeling that the world was a great deal larger than he had been allowing himself to believe it was, and that there was still a very great deal of it to be in. "You are beautiful," he said, which he had been waiting to say, and which was entirely true. "You are not bad yourself," she said, which made him laugh at the altar, which made her smile, which made the congregation decide collectively that this was already a good wedding. They said their vows with the full attention of two adults who know exactly what they are promising and are choosing it with everything they have. After the ceremony, when the celebration was in full swing around them and the evening was coming in warm and golden, Wesley walked to the edge of the churchyard and stood for a moment looking north, in the direction of his homestead and the hill with the oak tree. He was aware that he was standing in the same town where he had lost the two people most precious to him, and that grief had not gone away and would not go away, and also that he was standing here with a woman he loved and a life that had been given back to him somehow, not as a replacement for anything but as a continuation, the next part of a story he had thought was finished. Maria came and stood beside him. She did not say anything. She just slipped her arm through his and stood with him looking north, as if she understood exactly what he was looking toward. After a moment he put his hand over hers. "Thank you," he said. "For what?" she said. "For being the reason I came back," he said. She leaned her head against his shoulder. "You would have found your way back eventually," she said. "The candles were just the timing." "Maybe," he said, "but I am glad you were here when they ran out." They moved both operations onto the combined land over the autumn of 1874, using the Ray's house as the main dwelling because it was larger and had the better kitchen, and converting Wesley's house into the bunkhouse and storage that a growing ranch needed. They hired two hands in the spring of 1875, brothers named Rafael and Domingo Castillo, who were excellent with cattle, and who Maria had known by reputation through the Montoya family, and the Crawford Ranch, which they named simply that. The Crawford Ranch began to take the shape of something real. Wesley rode into Caldera Falls regularly now. Not because the grief had dissolved, because it had not, and never fully would, but because he had stopped treating avoidance as a form of loyalty to what he had lost. He had come to understand, in the way you understand things that someone you love says to you at the right moment, that wanting to live was the most honest way to honor Thomas and Jacob and Ruth, and that sitting in the dark was not a tribute to them. It was just sitting in the dark. He visited Old Clarence when the merchant came through and sometimes rode with him for a stretch of the road. He nodded to men on the street and sometimes stopped to talk. He was not, by nature, an expansive social person, but he was no longer a ghost in his own life. In the winter of 1874, on a cold night in December with the fire going and the wind off the mesa making the windows rattle, Maria told him she was pregnant. He sat very still for a moment. She watched him carefully. "I know this is," she began. "I am glad," he said, and the simpleness of it and the truth of it shut everything else down. "I am more glad than I know how to say." She exhaled slowly and came to him, and he put his arms around her and held her in the firelight with the December wind outside and the territory quiet except for the fire. And he let himself feel glad, completely and without condition. The pregnancy was healthy and full, and the winter was cold, and the spring came slowly and beautifully the way it does in New Mexico, with the wildflowers coming up along the road, and the sky doing that thing with the blue. And Maria continued to work her garden and manage her side of the ranch operations through all of it with the characteristic refusal to be diminished by any circumstance that Wesley had come to understand as one of the central facts of who she was. In the late spring of 1875, on a clear May evening with the mesa pink in the last light, Maria Hurst Crawford gave birth to a boy. He was born in the bedroom of the Ray's house with Doc Pierce in attendance and Old Clarence conveniently passing through that week, and elected himself to pace the yard, and Alina Montoya present to assist, and he arrived with considerable announcement, and the kind of healthy noise that immediately tells everyone in the vicinity that all is well. Wesley Crawford was permitted into the room shortly after, and he stood in the doorway and looked at his wife sitting up in the bed with their son in her arms, and the evening light was coming through the window, and she was looking down at the baby with the full completeness of her attention that she brought to everything, and he was very nearly unable to move for a moment. "Come and meet him," she said. He crossed the room and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the boy. He was red-faced and extraordinary and entirely real. "What do you want to call him?" Maria asked. He had thought about this. He had thought about it carefully over the months, and he had talked to Maria about it, and she had listened with that quality she had of listening with her whole self. "I would like to call him Eli," he said. "Eli Thomas Crawford, a middle name that was a bridge that said, you came from love and loss and you are the continuation of something, not a replacement, a continuation." Maria looked at him and her eyes were bright. "Eli Thomas Crawford," she said. "That is a good name." "He has a good name," Eli said, because he was already quite opinionated about the world apparently. Eli Thomas Crawford grew in the way of healthy children in the territory, quickly and vigorously, and with the apparently inherited family traits of strong opinions and a great deal of curiosity. He learned to walk on the porch of the Ray's house and to ride on Fletcher's back with his father's hand steady around him. And by the time he was 3, he was following the ranch hands around with the conviction that he was genuinely helpful, which Raphael and Domingo, who were kind men, encouraged without ever disabusing him of. In the summer of 1877, Maria told Wesley she was pregnant again. This time Wesley did not sit still. He picked her up, which made her laugh and protest that she was a grown woman and not a sack of flour, and he held her for a long time in the kitchen, and she held him back, and they were both laughing by the end of it. The second child arrived in early 1878, another boy, and they named him Samuel, and Eli, who was by now nearly 3 years old, received this development with the cautious diplomatic interest of someone who is not entirely sure yet whether this new development is going to work in his favor. By 1878, the Crawford Ranch was, without question, one of the better-run small ranches in the territory. They had 40 head of cattle, 12 horses, a stable relationship with the Navajo traders to the east, and a reputation for fair dealing that had begun to spread through the area in the way reputations for fair dealing do, slowly and solidly. The house had been extended. Maria had insisted on a proper library, which was one large shelf full of books that she had been accumulating since San Antonio, and which had been transported with her across the territory in a wooden crate that she had refused under any circumstances to leave behind. Wesley had built the shelf himself, and she had arranged the books on it with the satisfaction of someone who has found the thing exactly its right place. The green ribbon had been joined by several others and lived in a box on the dresser in their bedroom. Old Clarence was a permanent and beloved fixture at the ranch and spent more time there than on his circuit, and everyone politely pretended this was a commercial arrangement and not the obvious truth that he was family and they all knew it. One evening in the autumn of 1878, with Eli and Samuel both asleep and the house quiet and the fire going and the territory outside the window, doing something magnificent with the sunset, Wesley and Maria sat on the extended porch of what was now, without question, their home, and the contentment between them was a physical thing, warm and substantial. "I want to ask you something," Wesley said. "You always start things that way," she said, not looking up from the mending in her lap. "It works well," he said. She looked up and smiled at him. "What is it? Are you happy?" he said. She set down the mending and looked at him with the complete attention that had undone him the first time she turned it on him and had not gotten any less powerful in 4 years. "Yes," she said. "Wesley, I am so happy I sometimes cannot believe it is real." "Good," he said. "I am too." She reached across and took his hand, the way she had that first night on the porch when they were not yet anything but were clearly becoming something, and he held her hand and they watched the sunset over the Crawford ranch, their land, their cattle, their horses in the corral, their boys asleep inside, their life. There was something he did sometimes, every month or so, that Maria knew about and did not interfere with. He rode up to the hill behind the original homestead, which they still owned and maintained as part of the combined property. He rode up to the oak tree and he stood there for a while. He talked to them sometimes, Thomas and Jacob and Ruth. He told them what had happened, what was happening, what was going to happen. He told them about Maria and about Eli and Samuel. He told them that he had not forgotten, that he would not forget, that the forgetting was not the point. The point, he had come to understand, was exactly what Maria had said on the road in the April sunset of 1874, that there was room for both things, that grief and love did not cancel each other out but lived together in the large house of a human heart with enough room for everyone. He believed that now. He believed it completely. The oak tree cast its shade over the 3 graves and over Wesley Crawford standing in its shadow, and the mesa stretched out below the hill in all its impossible ancient beauty. And the sky was enormous, and the territory was enormous, and his life had turned out to be larger than he had, in 3 years of sitting in the dark, been willing to let it be. He rode down from the hill on a November afternoon in 1878, with the cold coming in off the mountains and the smell of wood smoke from the house below him. And as he came down the slope toward the fence line, he could hear Eli's voice from the yard, high and energetic and completely certain of himself, and Maria's voice answering him with that warm, clear quality that was the sound of home. And the light was on in the kitchen window of the Ray's house, the Crawford house, their house. He rode to the corral and unsaddled Fletcher and rubbed him down with the attentiveness of a man who respects his animals, and then he went inside. The kitchen was warm and full of the smell of supper, and Eli was sitting at the table drawing horses, with a piece of charcoal on brown paper, and Samuel was in his chair making the decisive and opinionated sounds of a 9-month-old who has a great deal to communicate, and Maria was at the stove turning something in the cast iron pan with one hand, and holding a book open on the counter with the other, because she was constitutionally unable to not be doing 2 things at once. She turned when he came in, and the smile she gave him was the one he had been the recipient of for 4 years now, and which he was fairly certain he would never in his life get tired of receiving. "Supper in 20 minutes, she said. "It smells excellent," he said. "It is excellent," she said, with the complete absence of false modesty that was one of her finest qualities. He washed up at the basin and sat down at the table across from Eli, who pushed the horse drawing toward him for assessment. "What do you think?" Eli said. Wesley studied it seriously because Eli deserved to be taken seriously. "The head is very good," he said. The legs are still a little complicated." "Horses have a lot of legs," Eli said, with the tone of someone who has identified a design flaw. "4," Wesley said. "That is a lot," Eli maintained. "He has a point," Maria said from the stove, without turning around. Wesley looked at his son, who was regarding him with the calm confidence of someone who has just been vindicated by a higher authority, and then he looked at Maria's back, at the way she was standing at the stove with complete ease, Samuel making commentary from his chair beside her, and the fire in the hearth and the books on the shelf, and the supper coming together in the cast iron pan. He thought of a September morning in 1871, when 2 boys had ridden into town and had not come home, and of 3 graves on a hill, and of a locked door and 3 years of dark, and of a store bell ringing in April and a woman in a blue calico dress standing in a doorway with flour on her apron and the sun behind her. He thought of candles and of Old Clarence and of a brown mare on Copper Creek Road, and a notebook with fence measurements and a judge in Loretta, and a length of green ribbon and a creek in June, and 2 voices saying yes in the evening, and a September wedding, and 2 boys asleep in a room down the hall. He thought of all the things that had to happen in exactly the order they happened for him to be sitting at this table in this kitchen on this ranch in this territory on this November evening watching his son draw horses while his wife made supper and his youngest child told the world what he thought about it. "Papa," Eli said, "are you listening?" "I am listening," Wesley said. "Good," Eli said, "because I have a plan for the horses that I need your opinion on." "Tell me the plan," Wesley said. And Eli told him the plan. And Maria turned from the stove with the good smile on her face, and Samuel offered his ongoing commentary. And the fire burned warm against the New Mexico November. And the Crawford Ranch sat on its 80 acres under the enormous sky, solid and real and alive. And Wesley Crawford was present in every second of it. He had ridden into town 3 years after losing his sons because the candles ran out and the coffee was gone, and Old Clarence had not come. He had ridden into town, and he had heard a bell ring and seen a door open, and met a woman who listened and cared and carried cornbread in her coat pocket, and was not afraid of anything that deserved to be afraid of. He had ridden into town and come home a different man, not a healed man, for grief does not heal the way a cut heals. It simply becomes part of the structure of you, but a man who was present and alive and choosing, every single day, to be both. He had ridden into town because the candles ran out. He had ridden into town because Maria Hurst was there. And the rest of his life was the best part of the story.